What if I told you that a country completely broke, humiliated, and on the brink of collapse, somehow built one of the most terrifying military machines in history? No money, no credibility, no power. And yet, within just a few years, Germany was marching toward war again. Was it genius? Was it manipulation? Or was it something far darker? Tonight, you will discover the hidden tricks, secret schemes, and brutal realities behind Hitler's rise, how debt became weapons, how lies became power, and how millions paid the price. Stay with me, because this is not just history. This is the chilling blueprint of how power can be built on deception. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. A nation once proud now lay broken beneath the weight of the Treaty of Versailles. Factories were silent. Bread lines stretched endlessly through cold streets. Mothers counted coins just to feed their children. Veterans wandered like ghosts, haunted by battlefields they could never escape. The German mark collapsed into worthlessness. People carried money in wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread. And in this atmosphere of despair, anger, and desperation, a man emerged. Adolf Hitler did not arrive with armies. He arrived with words, words that burned, words that promised, words that blamed. He told the people that Germany had not lost the war. It had been betrayed. He spoke of humiliation, of lost glory, of a nation that would rise again. And as crowds grew, so did his power. But behind the fiery speeches, a chilling question lingered. How could a bankrupt nation build one of the most terrifying war machines the world had ever seen? The truth is darker than propaganda. Hitler did not rebuild Germany's military through honesty. He did it through deception, exploitation, and economic illusion. First came MEFO bills, a hidden financial trick. Germany could not openly rearm because of international law, so Hitler created a fake company, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO. The government paid arms manufacturers with promissory notes instead of cash. On paper, Germany appeared financially stable. In reality, it was borrowing from the future, stacking debt like a house of cards. Weapons were built, tanks rolled off assembly lines, fighter planes pierced the skies, and the world barely noticed because it was hidden behind clever accounting. Then came forced economic control. Independent businesses were squeezed, workers were pushed into state-directed labor, strikes were crushed. The economy no longer served the people, it served the war machine. Factories that once made consumer goods were converted into weapons plants. Bread, clothing, and housing became secondary to guns, bombs, and aircraft. Next came plunder and theft. As Hitler expanded beyond Germany's borders, he did not just conquer lands, he drained them dry. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and later much of Europe became financial fuel for the Nazi war machine. Gold was stolen, banks were emptied, art was looted, resources were seized, entire economies were bent to serve Germany's military ambitions. And then there was the most horrifying source of funding: human suffering. Millions were enslaved in forced labor camps, prisoners of war, Jews, political dissidents, and civilians from occupied nations were worked to death in factories, mines, and construction sites. Their unpaid labor became the invisible foundation of Hitler's military expansion. Every tank had blood in its steel. Every bullet carried the weight of suffering. Every plane in the sky was built on broken human lives. To the outside world, Germany appeared reborn, disciplined, organized, powerful. Streets were cleaner, unemployment fell, parades filled with soldiers marched in perfect formation. But beneath that polished surface was rot, an economy built on lies, a military built on stolen wealth, a nation marching toward destruction, fueled by fear, hatred, and brutality. And in 1945, when Berlin lay in ruins, when flames consumed the Reichstag, when Hitler himself vanished into the ashes of his bunker, the world finally saw the truth. Germany had not been strong, It had been burning from the inside all along, a giant standing on feet of sand, a war machine powered by deception, a nightmare dressed as revival. And history would remember this bitter lesson. Power built on cruelty does not last. Empires built on lies eventually collapse. And the price is always paid in blood. Germany in 1919 did not simply lose a war, it collapsed into a long, suffocating silence that weighed on every street, every household, and every breath of its people. The armistice had ended the shooting, but for ordinary Germans, the suffering had only begun, shifting from the battlefield to their own doorsteps. The Treaty of Versailles did not arrive as a document alone. It arrived like a hammer that shattered what remained of the German state, its pride, its economy, and its sense of identity. To many Germans, it felt less like peace and more like a slow execution carried out with signatures instead of bullets. Across the country, cities bore the scars of years of total war. Berlin, once a vibrant capital of industry and culture, now appeared exhausted, its factories half functioning, its streets crowded with hungry faces, its air filled with tension rather than hope. Hamburg's bustling ports had lost much of their international trade, leaving dock workers idle and families struggling to survive. In the Ruhr, coal mines and steel mills that had powered Germany's war machine were now subject to restrictions, reparations demands, and foreign oversight, creating resentment that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. The sense that Germany had been unfairly punished spread quickly, becoming a shared emotional wound that connected people from every social class. The treaty stripped Germany of territory, manpower, and resources, but more painful than the material losses was the humiliation written into every clause. The war guilt clause forced the nation to accept responsibility for the entire conflict, a bitter pill for veterans who believed they had fought bravely and for civilians who felt they had already suffered enough. Entire regions such as Alsace-Lorraine were taken away, separating families and erasing familiar landscapes from the German map. Colonies overseas were seized, removing not only economic assets, but also a sense of imperial standing that had once made Germany feel powerful on the world stage. Every lost kilometer of land felt like a lost piece of national dignity. Reparations became a looming specter over the German economy, an impossible burden that crushed any hope of quick recovery. The new government in Weimar inherited a broken treasury and an angry population, yet was expected to make enormous payments to the very nations that had defeated them. Taxes rose, prices fluctuated, and uncertainty became a constant companion for businesses and workers alike. Farmers struggled to sell their crops at fair prices, while industrialists faced shrinking markets and rising costs, creating a cycle of frustration that affected both rural villages and urban centers. In cafes and taverns, ions were filled with bitterness toward politicians, foreigners, and the treaty that many saw as an act of revenge rather than justice. Then came hyperinflation, a catastrophe that turned money into meaningless paper. The German mark began to spiral out of control, losing value at a terrifying speed that ordinary people could barely comprehend. Salaries paid in the morning were worthless by the afternoon, forcing workers to rush to spend their wages before they evaporated. Families carried stacks of banknotes in baskets or wheelbarrows just to buy bread, milk, or potatoes, an image that became symbolic of Germany's downfall. Savings that had taken decades to build vanished overnight, destroying the middle class and leaving retirees and widows in despair. In one heartbreaking twist, children played with bundles of cash as toys because it was cheaper than buying real ones. Social life fractured under this pressure as trust between neighbors eroded and desperation pushed people to extreme behavior. Black markets flourished, with scarce goods traded in shadows, while official shops remained empty or overpriced. Crime increased in major cities, where hunger and unemployment drove some to theft and others to prostitution just to survive. Political violence erupted in the streets, with clashes between communists, nationalists, and government forces, turning Germany into a battleground even in peacetime. In this atmosphere, many Germans no longer saw themselves as citizens of a stable nation, but as survivors in a collapsing world. Perhaps the most haunting figures of this period were the returning soldiers, men who had fought in trenches from France to Russia and now found no place in the country they had bled for. They came home carrying not only physical wounds but psychological scars that would never fully heal. Some walked with missing limbs, others with shattered minds, and many with a deep sense of betrayal by politicians who had agreed to what they saw as a disgraceful peace. These veterans wandered through cities in worn uniforms, often unable to find work, staring at a society that seemed to have moved on without them. Their presence was a constant reminder that the war's trauma had not ended. It had simply changed form. Families, too, were forever altered, with millions of households mourning fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. Women who had kept factories and farms running during the war now faced a future of economic uncertainty and emotional exhaustion. Children grew up in a Germany that no longer resembled the one their parents had known, a place defined by scarcity rather than stability. In tenement apartments, families crowded into small rooms, sharing meals that were thinner and fewer than before. At night, the sounds of distant protest sirens or broken glass drifted through open windows, reinforcing the feeling that peace was fragile and temporary. Culturally, Germany seemed lost between its past glory and its black present, searching for meaning in a shattered world. Artists and writers captured this despair in dark paintings, haunting poetry, and experimental theater that reflected the nation's anxiety. Universities buzzed with debates about democracy, socialism, and nationalism, yet outside their walls, many ordinary Germans felt disconnected from such intellectual discussions. Churches struggled to offer comfort as congregations questioned why God had allowed such suffering to befall their nation. In beer halls and back rooms, new political movements began to take shape, feeding on the anger and humiliation that Versailles had planted deep within the German soul. The Weimar Republic, born out of defeat, tried to hold everything together, but it stood on unstable ground from the very beginning. Many Germans associated it not with democracy, but with surrender, calling it the November criminals' government for signing the armistice. Every economic crisis, every political scandal, every foreign demand for reparations weakened its legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Newspapers printed headlines filled with doom, fueling fear that Germany was sliding further into chaos. Meanwhile, foreign troops occupied parts of the Rhineland, a visible symbol that Germany was not truly free within its own borders. In the cold winters that followed the war, long lines formed outside soup kitchens and charity organizations where people waited in silence, wrapped in threadbare coats. Some clutched her Asian cards, others carried empty bags, all sharing the same hollow look of exhaustion. Children with pale faces and thin bodies stood beside their mothers, trying to understand why life had become so harsh so suddenly. Above them, the once proud German flag fluttered weakly in the wind, a tattered emblem of a nation that had fallen from its former strength. The rebuilding of Germany's military did not begin with roaring factories or marching armies. It began in quiet offices behind locked doors in the language of finance that most ordinary Germans would never see or fully understand. On the surface, the Weimar economy still appeared fragile, burdened by reparations, inflation, and international restrictions. Yet beneath that surface, a new and secretive system was being constructed that would allow Adolf Hitler to rearm the nation while pretending to obey the very laws meant to prevent it. This system revolved around a shadow company, an illusion wrapped in official paperwork known as MEFO, a name that sounded harmless but carried enormous historical consequences. MEFO, short for Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, did not exist in any meaningful way as a real business. It had no large workforce, no visible headquarters bustling with activity, and no genuine commercial purpose. Instead, it was created as a front, a financial mask that allowed the Nazi regime to channel massive funds into weapons production without openly breaking the Treaty of Versailles. To the outset, world, Germany appeared to be maintaining a cautious, limited military, but in reality, the gears of rearmament were already turning at full speed. The brilliance and danger of this deception lay in its simplicity. It turned war preparation into a matter of bookkeeping rather than open defiance. German arms manufacturers, companies like Krupp, Rheinmetall, and others, were instructed to begin producing weapons, artillery, vehicles, and military equipment on a scale that far exceeded what was legally permitted. Normally, this would have required vast sums of money that the German government did not officially possess. Instead of paying these companies directly in cash, the state issued them MEFO bills, essentially promissory notes that promised payment at a later date. These were not ordinary bonds. They were backed by the Reichsbank, but kept off the official government balance sheets, hidden from international scrutiny. For the industrialists, this was a risky arrangement, yet they trusted Hitler's growing power and the promise of future profits. Factories that had once produced civilian goods slowly shifted their focus toward military production, often without the public fully realizing the scale of the transformation. Machine tools were repurposed, assembly lines were redesigned, and engineers began working on designs for tanks, aircraft, and artillery that would later shock the world. Workers saw increased employment and steady wages, which created the illusion of economic recovery. Yet they were unknowingly contributing to a secret war economy. Every rifle assembled, every engine tested, every piece of steel molded into a weapon was financed through this elaborate web of financial deception. The MEFO system allowed Hitler to bypass traditional budget constraints and parliamentary oversight, concentrating power within his inner circle. Instead of debating military spending in the Reichstag, decisions were made behind closed doors, guided by his ambitions rather than democratic accountability. Economists within the Nazi regime carefully calculated how many MEFO bills could be issued before the system risked collapse, treating national survival as a mathematical equation. To them, this was not just about money, it was about time. Buying Germany the years it needed to rebuild its military strength before foreign powers fully realized what was happening. Internationally, the deception worked astonishingly well at first because many countries were preoccupied with their own economic problems during the Great Depression. Britain and France, exhausted from World War I and wary of another conflict, were reluctant to confront Germany aggressively. Their diplomats and financial experts saw Germany stabilizing economically and assumed this was a sign of responsible governance rather than a covert rearmament program. Meanwhile, inside Germany, propaganda painted the picture of a nation simply recovering from hardship, rising through hard work and discipline rather than secret military expansion. Banks played a crucial role in sustaining this illusion, as MEFO bills circulated through the financial system almost like real money. German financial institutions accepted them as legitimate instruments, allowing arms manufacturers to use them as collateral for loans and further investments. This created a feedback loop where the more weapons were produced, the more the economy appeared to grow, even though it was increasingly dependent on future payments that might never truly be sustainable. To many economists outside Germany, this seemed like a risky but fascinating experiment in economic revival. Within the Nazi leadership, there was constant tension between those who wanted rapid rearmament and those who feared economic collapse. Helmar Schacht, the Reichsbank president and later Minister of Economics, walked a dangerous tightrope between financial stability and Hitler's insatiable demand for military power. He understood that MEFO bills were essentially a ticking time bomb, a massive pile of debt disguised as prosperity. Yet he also knew that without this mechanism, Germany could not achieve the military strength Hitler desired, placing him in a morally and professionally compromised position. Ordinary Germans, meanwhile, experienced the effects of this system in more subtle ways, often interpreting them as signs of national revival. Unemployment began to drop as factories hired more workers, particularly in heavy industry and construction. New highways known as the Autobahn were built, symbolizing progress and modernity, though they also had strategic military value. Young men found opportunities in restructured military organizations that were officially presented as labor or training programs, but were quietly preparing them for war. The sense of national pride slowly returned, masking the underlying reality that this resurgence was built on hidden debt and deception. As rearmament accelerated, the scale of the MEFO scheme grew to staggering proportions, reaching billions of Reichsmarks. The financial sleight of hand became increasingly complex, requiring constant manipulation of banking regulations, currency controls, and government policies. Each new weapon deepened Germany's commitment to a path that would eventually lead to conflict, yet at the time it felt to many like a necessary step toward restoring lost greatness. The system rewarded loyalty to the regime as companies aligned with Nazi goals received lucrative contracts and political favor. Behind the scenes, foreign intelligence agencies began to suspect that something was amiss, though they struggled to prove it conclusively. Reports filtered in of increased German military activity, expanded factories, and suspicious financial practices, but concrete evidence was difficult to obtain. Hitler skillfully maintained a public image of restraint, occasionally making diplomatic gestures that reassured other nations, while continuing his covert buildup. The MEFO bills thus served not only as a financial tool, but as a shield behind which Germany could prepare for the wars that lay ahead. Within German society, this deception gradually blurred the line between economic recovery and militarization as everyday life became intertwined with the war machine. Schools introduced more physical training, youth organizations promoted discipline and obedience, and public ceremonies glorified military values. All of this was financed indirectly through the hidden mechanisms of MEFO, embedding the logic of war into the fabric of the nation. People who celebrated new jobs, improved infrastructure, or renewed national confidence rarely realized that these benefits were tied to a system designed for conflict. As the years passed, the MEFO bills became increasingly difficult to conceal, forcing the Nazi government to find new methods of financing rearmament. Yet by then, much of the damage, or from Hitler's perspective, much of the preparation, had already been done. Germany possessed a growing arsenal of modern weapons, a revitalized industrial base, and a population conditioned to accept military expansion as normal. The deception had served its purpose, transforming a defeated, impoverished nation into a rapidly militarizing power under the guise of economic recovery. The transformation of Germany's economy after 1933 did not happen suddenly or openly. It unfolded gradually like a tightening grip that few fully recognized until it was already inescapable. Once Hitler consolidated power, the market that had existed under the Weimar Republic, chaotic, fragile, but still somewhat pluralistic, began to disappear, replaced by a system in which the state decided what was produced, who produced it, and for what ultimate purpose. Economic freedom did not collapse overnight. It was slowly suffocated through laws, regulations, intimidation, and the ever-present threat of Nazi power. What emerged was not simply a recovering economy, but a carefully engineered machine designed to serve one overriding goal: preparation for war. At first, many Germans welcomed this shift, interpreting it as stability after years of uncertainty. Factories that had once struggled to find buyers were now flooded with government contracts, and workers who had endured unemployment felt a sense of relief as job opportunities expanded. Yet beneath this apparent prosperity lay a deep structural change. The economy was no longer meant to serve civilian needs. It existed primarily to feed the growing military. Civilian industries were slowly restructured, redirected, or outright dismantled if they did not contribute to rearmament. Consumer goods became less important than steel, engines, chemicals, and weapons, even if this meant shortages for ordinary families. The Nazi regime created a complex web of economic agencies that extended the state's reach into nearly every aspect of production. Ministries planning boards, and military officials worked together to dictate industrial priorities, often bypassing traditional business leaders. Private companies technically still existed, but their independence was largely an illusion, as they were pressured, coerced, or incentivized to align with government objectives. Business owners who resisted risked losing contracts, facing legal harassment, or being labeled politically unreliable, a dangerous accusation in a totalitarian system. Cooperation rather than innovation or competition became the dominant principle of the new economic order. Labor itself was reshaped to fit this war-centered vision, with the state increasingly controlling where people worked and under what conditions. Trade unions were abolished and replaced with the German Labor Front, which removed workers' ability to negotiate collectively. Strikes were banned, eliminating one of the few remaining tools workers had to protect their rights. In return, the regime promised job security and national unity, framing labor not as a personal livelihood, but as a patriotic duty. Factories became extensions of the state, places where individual concerns were secondary to national military goals. Women, who had played a crucial role in the wartime economy of World War I, were now encouraged to focus on family and motherhood rather than industrial work, at least in official rhetoric. However, as rearmament accelerated, the regime quietly relied on female labor in certain sectors, particularly in textiles, manufacturing, and clerical positions. This contradiction revealed the tension at the heart of the Nazi economy. Ideology demanded one thing, practical necessity often required another. Meanwhile, young men were funneled into military service or pre-military training programs disguised as labor initiatives, gradually militarizing an entire generation. Agriculture was also brought under tighter state control as the regime sought to make Germany more self-sufficient in food production. Farmers were pressured to follow government quotas and pricing regulations, limiting their independence in exchange for stability. Large estates were favored, while small farmers often struggled under bureaucratic demands. Propaganda glorified rural life as the backbone of the nation, yet in reality, many agricultural communities found themselves squeezed between ideological expectations and economic hardship. The countryside, like the cities, was being reshaped to serve a future war rather than present needs. Raw materials became a central obsession of the state-controlled economy, as Germany lacked many of the resources required for large-scale military production. Synthetic alternatives were developed for rubber, fuel, and other critical supplies, a scientific effort driven by strategic necessity. Chemical companies expanded rapidly, working closely with the government to create substitutes that would reduce dependence on foreign imports. These innovations were presented as evidence of German ingenuity, yet they were born out of a recognition that the nation was preparing for a conflict that might cut it off from the world. Every scientific breakthrough was thus intertwined with military ambition. Infrastructure projects, most famously the Autobahn, played a dual role in this economic transformation. Publicly, they were symbols of modernization and employment, providing jobs to thousands of workers who had previously been idle. Privately, they were designed with military logistics in mind, allowing rapid movement of troops and equipment across the country. Bridges, railways, and industrial zones were similarly planned to support future mobilization. What appeared to be national renewal was in many ways a carefully disguised preparation for war. The financial system was also bent to the will of the state, with banks and investors encouraged or compelled to support rearmament-related industries. Credit flowed more easily to companies aligned with Nazi priorities, while sectors deemed less important struggled to secure funding. This created a distorted economy in which profitability mattered less than strategic value. Some businessmen grew wealthy under this arrangement, benefiting from government contracts and political favoritism, while others found themselves marginalized or ruined for failing to conform. Propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public perception of this economic shift, portraying it as a miracle of national revive. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films celebrated the return of employment, the strength of German industry, and the discipline of the workforce. Little attention was given to the growing scarcity of consumer goods, rising state control, or the long-term risks of such an unbalanced economy. Many Germans, weary from years of hardship, accepted this narrative with relief, preferring the promise of order over the messy reality of democracy. Education and youth programs were subtly integrated into this state-controlled economic vision, training young people not just as citizens, but as future workers or soldiers for the regime. Schools emphasized physical fitness, obedience, and loyalty, preparing students for roles in factories, laboratories, or the military. Organizations like the Hitler Youth blurred the line between education and indoctrination, instilling a sense that personal ambition should always serve national objectives. The economy, culture, and ideology thus became increasingly inseparable. As rearmament intensified, the pressure on workers grew harsher, with longer hours, stricter discipline, and greater surveillance in the workplace. Managers were often aligned with the Nazi Party, ensuring political conformity alongside productivity. Dissent, even mild criticism, could lead to dismissal, arrest, or worse. In this environment, fear replaced free expression, and economic participation became a form of political obedience. The factory floor turned into another arena of control, mirroring the broader authoritarian nature of the regime. Foreign trade was gradually subordinated to military planning, as Germany sought to reduce its dependence on external markets. Bilateral agreements were negotiated with certain countries, often under unequal terms that favored German interests. Smaller nations found themselves economically tied to Germany, supplying raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods or political protection. This economic influence would later become a tool of domination, blurring the line between commerce and conquest. Behind the scenes, Nazi economic planners constantly debated how far state control should extend, revealing internal tensions within the regime. Some favored a fully centralized system, while others believed that limited private enterprise could still serve military goals more efficiently. Hitler himself often intervened unpredictably, prioritizing ideological or strategic concerns over economic logic. This created an atmosphere of uncertainty even among those who benefited from the system, as policy could shift suddenly based on political whims. Meanwhile, the everyday lives of ordinary Germans were gradually reshaped by this war-oriented economy, even if they did not fully grasp its implications. Rationing became more common, luxury items grew scarce, and consumer choice narrowed. Families learned to adapt to shortages, recycling materials, repairing rather than replacing goods, and accepting government NT messaging that framed sacrifice as patriotic. What began as economic recovery slowly revealed itself as a society being mobilized step by step for a conflict that had not yet begun. As Germany's military strength grew, so too did Hitler's appetite for expansion, and with every border crossed, the Nazi state discovered a new and brutally efficient way to finance its war machine. Conquest did not merely mean political domination, it meant systematic economic extraction, a cold and calculated draining of entire nations that transformed occupied Europe into a financial lifeline for the Third Reich. What began as territorial ambition quickly evolved into a continent-wide system of organized plunder, where every bank, factory, farm, and household became a potential resource to be seized, redirected, or stripped bare in service of German power. When German troops marched into Austria in 1938, the Anschluss was presented as a peaceful reunification of German-speaking peoples, but behind the propaganda lay an immediate and ruthless economic takeover. Austrian gold reserves were transferred to Berlin, banks were brought under German control, and Jewish-owned businesses were confiscated under racial laws that had already been perfected in Germany. Wealth that had taken generations to build was erased overnight, swallowed by a regime that saw occupied territory not as partners but as property. For many Austrians, the transition felt less like unity and more like a silent legalized robbery carried out with uniforms and paperwork instead of guns. The pattern only intensified with the occupation of Czechoslovakia, a nation that possessed significant industrial capacity and valuable resources. The famous Skoda Works, one of Europe's largest arms manufacturers, was swiftly absorbed into the German war economy, its factories repurposed to produce tanks, artillery, and military vehicles for the Wehrmacht. Czech workers found themselves laboring not for their own country, but for the very force that had erased it from the map. Raw materials, machinery, and finished goods flowed steadily toward Germany, transforming a once independent economy into a subsidiary of Nazi military planning. Banks in occupied countries were systematically looted, their vaults emptied under the guise of administrative control or war contributions. In France, after its swift defeat in 1940, the Vichy government was forced to pay enormous occupation costs to Germany, effectively funding the very army that had conquered it. These payments were far beyond France's economic capacity, forcing the printing of money, inflation, and hardship for ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, German officials lived comfortably in Paris, requisitioning luxury hotels, art collections, and fine dining, a grotesque contrast to the suffering spreading across the rest of the country. Art and cultural treasures became another target of Nazi plunder, as Hitler and his inner circle sought to build vast collections for themselves and for a planned Führer museum in Linz. Paintings, sculptures, and historical artifacts were seized from museums, galleries, and private homes, particularly those belonging to Jewish families. Entire lifetimes of cultural heritage were packed into crates and shipped to Germany, while the original owners were often sent to ghettos, camps, or forced into exile. This theft was not random. It was meticulously organized by specialized units that treated looting as an official state policy. In Eastern Europe, the plunder took on an even harsher and more exploitative character, as Nazi ideology viewed Slavic populations as inferior and expendable. In Poland, vast agricultural lands were seized and placed under German administration, while Polish farmers were forced to meet production quotas under threat of punishment. Food supplies were redirected to feed German soldiers and civilians, leaving local populations facing shortages and famine. Cities like Warsaw were stripped of resources, their industries dismantled or repurposed, their economic life subordinated entirely to German needs. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked the most extreme phase of economic exploitation, as Nazi planners envisioned the East as a colonial empire that would sustain Germany indefinitely. Grain, oil, minerals, and timber, were seized on a massive scale with little regard for the survival of local populations. Entire regions were deliberately deprived of food in what amount to engineered starvation policy, particularly in Ukraine, which was seen as the breadbasket of Europe. Trains carried away endless shipments of resources to Germany, while millions of civilians were left to suffer and die in their wake. Industrial assets in occupied territories were either dismantled and transported to Germany or converted to serve the Reich's war production. Factories in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France were compelled to produce goods for the German military, often under German supervision. Skilled workers were coerced into continuing their labor, knowing that refusal could mean arrest, deportation, or execution. In many cases, local managers remained in place, forced to collaborate with the occupiers in order to keep their businesses and sometimes their families alive. Currency manipulation became another tool of economic domination as Germany imposed artificial exchange rates that favored the Reich at the expense of occupied nations. Local currencies were devalued, making it easier for German authorities to purchase goods cheaply while exporting inflation and scarcity to the local population. Black markets flourished in response. As people tried to survive in an economy distorted by foreign control, everyday transactions became fraught with uncertainty, corruption, and fear. Gold, jewelry, and personal valuables were confiscated not only from governments, but from individuals, especially Jews and political opponents. In many occupied countries, special offices were established to register and seize assets deemed enemy property. Homes were E-rated, safes opened, and possessions cataloged before being shipped away or redistributed to German officials and settlers. For countless families, this meant losing not only their wealth, but the tangible memories of their lives, heirlooms that could never be recovered. The plunder extended even to human bodies, as occupied nations were forced to supply labor to the German war effort. Millions of men and women were deported to work in German factories, farms, and construction sites under brutal conditions. Their labor replaced German workers who had been drafted into the military, effectively turning conquered populations into economic assets. Trains filled with terrified civilians left cities across Europe heading toward an unknown fate that for many ended in exhaustion, abuse, or death far from home. Local collaborationist governments played a significant role in facilitating this exploitation, whether out of ideological alignment, coercion, or a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of order. In Norway, Denmark, and other occupied countries, puppet administrations helped implement German economic policies, collect taxes, and enforce labor conscription. This created deep divisions within societies, as some viewed collaborators as traitors, while others saw them as pragmatists trying to prevent even worse suffering. Resistance movements across Europe recognized that economic sabotage could be as powerful as armed rebellion, targeting railways, factories, and supply lines that fed the German war machine. Partisans blew up trains carrying stolen resources, destroyed bridges, and disrupted production wherever possible. Each act of sabotage was a small but meaningful blow against a system built on exploitation, though it often brought brutal reprisals against civilian populations. Within Germany itself, the benefits of this continental plunder were visible in improved living standards for many ordinary Germans, at least in the early years of the war. Store shelves were better stocked than in occupied countries, factories operated at full capacity, and the Reich appeared economically strong. Few citizens fully grasped or chose to acknowledge that their relative comfort was built on the suffering of millions beyond their borders. Nazi economic planners meticulously tracked the flow of stolen wealth, treating occupied Europe as a vast spreadsheet of assets to be optimized. Reports detailed how much grain was extracted from Ukraine, how much steel from France, how much gold from Austria, reducing human lives to numbers and resources. This cold bureaucratic approach masked the immense human tragedy underlying every transaction. As the war dragged on, however, the limits of this exploitative system began to show as resistance, logistical challenges, and Allied bombing disrupted German control. Yet until the very end, the Nazi regime continued to squeeze occupied territories for every possible advantage, unwilling to relinquish even a fraction of its ill-gotten gains. For millions across Europe, daily life remained defined by scarcity, fear, and the knowledge that their land, labor, and wealth were being consumed by a foreign power that saw them not as people, but as fuel for its ambition. Forced labor became one of the darkest, most hidden pillars beneath Hitler's military power, an invisible engine that powered factories, built roads, mined resources, and kept the German war machine running long after its own workforce had been swallowed by the army. What many Germans saw as industrial efficiency or economic revival was, in reality, sustained by the exhaustion, pain, and death of millions of men, women, and even children dragged from their homes across Europe. This was not accidental or incidental. It was a deliberate system designed by the Nazi state where human beings were reduced to tools measured not by their lives or dignity, but by how much work they could extract before they collapsed. As Germany prepared for and then entered war, the demand for labor inside the Reich exploded while the number of available German workers shrank due to mass conscription into the military. Factories manufacturing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and machinery needed hands. Mines needed bodies to dig, farms needed workers to harvest food, and construction projects required endless manual effort. Instead of reducing military ambitions or improving conditions for German laborers, the Nazi regime chose a far more brutal salute. Ion. It turned to the populations it conquered, treating entire nations as reservoirs of forced workers to be drained at will. The process began with so-called labor recruitment, which was often nothing more than a thinly disguised form of kidnapping. In occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and later the Soviet Union, German officials and collaborationist authorities organized roundups in cities, villages, and workplaces. Men and women were summoned under threats, told they would be working temporarily in Germany for good wages, or simply seized from their homes in the middle of the night. Families watched helplessly as loved ones were loaded onto trains, not knowing if they would ever return. The platform filled with tears, screams, and desperate goodbyes. The journey itself was often dehumanizing, as thousands were packed into cattle cars with little food, water, or sanitation. Some died before even reaching Germany, their bodies discarded at stops along the way, treated as inconveniences rather than human tragedies. For those who survived the trip, arrival did not bring relief, only a new form of imprisonment disguised as employment. They were registered, categorized, and assigned numbers, stripped of their identities and reduced to entries in a vast bureaucratic system of exploitation. Once inside Germany, forced laborers were scattered across factories, farms, mines, and construction sites, working under harsh and often brutal conditions. In industrial centers like the Ruhr or Berlin, they toiled in arms factories, producing the very weapons that would later be used against their own countries. They worked long hours with minimal rest, inadequate food, and constant surveillance by guards or overseers. Any sign of resistance, slowing down, or exhaustion could result in beatings, imprisonment, or deportation to concentration camps. In rural areas, forced laborers were sent to work on German farms, replacing local men who had gone to fight in the war. They lived in barns, sheds, or overcrowded barracks, isolated from the rest of society and treated as property rather than people. Many suffered physical abuse from farm owners who saw them not as workers but as subhuman servants, an attitude encouraged by Nazi racial ideology. Despite their misery, they were expected to produce food that would sustain both the German population and the military at the front. In the mines, conditions were even more terrifying, as forced laborers descended deep underground to extract coal, iron, and other vital materials for the war effort. Accidents were common, safety measures were minimal, and exhaustion claimed lives daily. The darkness of the tunnels mirrored the darkness of their fate, as they labored endlessly in suffocating heat, breathing in dust that slowly destroyed too. Air lungs. Many never saw daylight again, buried beneath the earth they had been forced to dig. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this system was its integration with the concentration camp network, where forced labor reached its most extreme and lethal form. Camps like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen were not only sites of imprisonment and murder, they were also massive labor complexes. Prisoners, including Jews, political dissidents, Roma, and prisoners of war, were worked to the brink of death in quarries, factories, and construction projects. The infamous motto, Arbeit macht frei, meaning work makes you free, hung cruelly over camp gates, a grotesque lie that mocked the suffering within. Companies like IG Farben, Krupp, and others profited directly from this system, establishing factories near or inside camps to exploit prisoner labor. In places like Auschwitz, inmates were forced to work in chemical plants under toxic conditions that caused severe illness and death. They were given barely enough food to survive, often a thin soup and a piece of bread, while performing back-breaking labor for hours on end. When they became too weak to work, they were simply replaced, discarded like broken machinery. The Nazi regime categorized forced laborers based on race and nationality, with Eastern Europeans and Soviet prisoners treated the worst. Poles and Russians were often subjected to stricter controls, worse living conditions, and more violent treatment to Han Western European workers. They were required to wear identifying badges, banned from public spaces, and forbidden from forming relationships with Germans. This racial hierarchy reinforced the idea that their suffering was not only acceptable but justified in the eyes of the regime. Children were not spared from this exploitation, as teenagers and even younger boys and girls were forced into labor alongside adults. Some were taken from orphanages or separated from their parents during deportations, ending up in factories or farms where they worked far beyond their physical capacity. Many suffered lifelong trauma, malnutrition, and psychological scars that would remain long after the war ended. Their lost childhoods became another invisible cost of Germany's military expansion. Despite the brutality, small acts of humanity and resistance sometimes emerged within this system of forced labor. Some German workers secretly shared food, clothing, or information with laborers, risking punishment if caught. Others sabotaged machinery or slowed production in subtle ways to undermine the war effort. Among the laborers themselves, solidarity helped some survive as they supported one another emotionally, shared scarce resources, and maintained a sense of dignity in an environment designed to strip it away. As the war intensified, the reliance on forced labor only grew, with millions more deported from newly occupied territories. By 1944, millions of foreign workers were inside Germany, many forming a massive exploited underclass that kept the economy functioning even as Allied bombs fell on cities and factories. Without this forced labor force, Germany's military production would likely have collapsed much earlier, a fact recognized by historians as one of the regime's most ruthless yet effective strategies. The moral cost of this system was immeasurable, as countless lives were broken, destroyed, or forever altered in service of Hitler's ambitions. Families across Europe were torn apart, communities emptied of their young people, and entire generations scarred by their experiences. Yet within Germany, much of this suffering remained hidden or ignored, as propaganda shielded the public from the full reality of what was being done in their name. As Allied armies advanced toward Germany in the final years of the war, forced laborers began to be moved, abandoned, or even killed to erase evidence of their exploitation. Long death marches carried weakened prisoners across freezing landscapes, where many perished from exhaustion or execution. In factories, some workers were released, while others were left behind in chaos as the Nazi system crumbled. When liberation finally came, survivors emerged from camps, factories, and farms in terrible physical condition, many barely recognizable as the people they once were. They carried with them stories of brutality, starvation, and loss that the world would struggle to fully comprehend. Meanwhile, the factories, roads, and weapons they had built remained as silent testaments to how deeply forced labor had been woven into the fabric of Germany's war economy, a hidden foundation made not of steel or money, but of human suffering. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.